Good Thursday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's, daily Bible reading for November the 30th, the last day of November. We're going to be here in Ezra chapter 3 today. Hope that your week has gone well so far. So good to see those who are able to make it out last night. And let's keep on reading our way through the text of Ezra today. Again, we're in chapter 3. Remember, yesterday we had the description of those who decided to go back. I think that's probably an important thing to mention, that Cyrus didn't force anybody to go back, it seems. He allowed those who desired to go back to Israel to go back to the promised land. And chapter 2 tells us those who had the desire to go back to the land. So once they get back, the text tells us that they immediately settle in their towns, and the rest of Israel settled in their towns. And then a little bit later, they're all going to arrive together as one in Jerusalem. So let's read about that here in Ezra chapter 3, beginning of verse number 1. Ezra chapter 3, verse number 1, when the 7th month arrived and the Israelites were in their towns, the people gathered as one in Jerusalem. Jeshua, son of Jozadak, and his brothers, the priests, along with Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his brothers, began to build the altar of Yahweh's of Israel's God, in order to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. They set up the altar on its foundation and offered burnt offerings for the morning and evening on it to Yahweh, even though they feared the surrounding peoples. They celebrated the festival of shelters as prescribed and offered burnt offerings each day based on the number specified by ordinance for each festival day. After that, they offered the regular burnt offering and the offerings for the beginning of each month and for all Israel's appointed holy occasions, as well as the freewill offerings brought to Yahweh. On the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to Yahweh, even though the foundation of Yahweh's temple had not yet been laid. They gave money to the stonecutters and artisans, and gave food, drink, and oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre, so they would bring cedar wood from Lebanon to Joppa by sea, according to the authorization given by King Cyrus of Persia. In the second month, on the second year, after they arrived at Yahweh's house in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Yeshua, son of Jozadak, and the rest of his brothers, including the priests, the Levites, and all who had returned to Jerusalem from captivity, began to build. They appointed the Levites, who were 20 years old or more, to supervise the work on Yahweh's house. Jeshua with his sons and brothers, Kadmiel with his sons and the sons of Judah, and a son of Henadad with their sons and brothers, the Levites, joined together to supervise those working on the house of God. When the builders had laid the foundation of Yahweh's temple, the priests, dressed in their robes and holding trumpets, and the Levites ascended from Asaph, holding cymbals, took their positions to praise Yahweh, as King David of Israel had instructed. They sang with praise and thanksgiving to Yahweh, for he is good. His faithful love to Israel endures forever. Then all the people gave a great shout of praise to Yahweh, because the foundation of Yahweh's house had been laid. But many of the older priests, Levites, and family heads who had seen the first temple wept loudly when they saw the foundation of this temple, but many others shouted joyfully. The people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shouting from that of the weeping, because the people were shouting so loudly, and the sound was heard from far away. And that is Ezra chapter 3. Again, once they arrive here back in the promised land, they divide up, they go to their each individual houses. Again, chapter 2 and verse 70 says, the priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, temple servants, and some of the people settled in their towns, and the rest of Israel settled in their towns. But then here comes the 7th month. And in the 7th month, we see a very important word begin to be seen among the people, and the word is unity. They unify as one. They gather together as one. There is unity in Jerusalem. And notice as well that the leaders take the role of leadership, which sounds a bit redundant, right? But think about, somebody has to swing the first hammer. Somebody has to move the first stone. And that was the role of Jeshua and his brothers priests and Zerubbabel and many others. They began to build. That same phrase is used in a few verses whenever it comes to actual temple. In verse number 8, that those people, same people mentioned, they began to build in the middle of verse number 8. So those who were leaders actually did what leaders do. They stepped up and they led by example. They showed this is what we need to do. We need to get to work. So we're going to show you that by example, by ourselves getting to work. So they do that first on the altar, so that they can begin offering sacrifices to God. It would stand to reason, I think, that while they were in captivity, they did not have the opportunity to offer sacrifices as they had opportunity now to do. So they get back to doing that, offering the burnt offerings, the morning and evening offerings. They even celebrate the festival of shelters as prescribed with its burnt offerings. So verses 2 through 6, all about the various offerings that were being made by the people. And notice as well at the end of verse number 3 that they did this even though they feared the surrounding peoples. Even though they feared the surrounding peoples, more than likely, those who were in the land still probably were not big fans of the Jewish people since they had come in and taken the land, and then they had been taken out of the land, expelled from the land, and now they're back in the land again. Probably not very happy that these people keep showing up and taking the land that these people probably feel like is theirs. But notice that even in spite of the fact that there was fear, they still acted. And that's such a important thing to think about. Whenever we're fearful, what do? Do we just freeze up? Do we just clam up and do nothing? Or do we seek to grow closer to God? Do we seek to move closer to God through prayer? Their way of doing that was through offerings. How might we do that? Well, we might do that through prayer, by praying to God or by spending time in his word, growing or moving ourselves closer to God in the times of fear. We see that example from the Israelites here. And I think it's a really, really good example for us to follow. We also see in this text that the temple, at the end of verse 6, the temple foundation had not yet been laid. So they have to go ahead and start doing the process of gathering supplies in order for them to be able to lay the foundation. They have foreign aid in this. They reach out to Tyre and Sidon and get cedar logs to be dropped into the water so they can float down to Israel. That's what they do. And this is all, again, being authorized by King Cyrus. He knows that this is something that God wants, so he respects that, and he does it. And he provides everything the Israelites need in order to restore their temple. So about 7 months later, in verse number 8, about 7 months later, they are able to begin on the actual foundation itself. The actual foundation begins to be laid here. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's the leaders who do the first actions of building. They're the ones that swing the first hammer, move the first stones, cut the first logs, and they get the Levites to come and help out, of course. But notice that it's 20 years old or more, which is younger than what we see prescribed in the laws, probably because there's just not very many of them. So they go ahead and employ more Levites to be able to get involved in the work in order to help this process go a bit more smoothly. So as they're doing this, as they're working, and once they have the foundation laid, the text tells us that the people, they pause and they rejoice. That the priests dressed in their robes and holding trumpets, the Levites holding cymbals, took their positions to praise Yahweh, as King David of Israel had instructed. They sang with the praise and thanksgiving to Yahweh, for he is good. His faithful love to Israel endures forever. They were celebrating the progress. And I think that's another good example for us to think about their example of celebrating progress. They saw that something good had happened. And instead of just brushing it off and saying, oh, well, that's what's supposed to happen anyways, they paused to celebrate. And their celebration included an exaltation of Yahweh as the one who allowed them to do this, that he is good, his faithful love endures forever, even though, let's be honest, that might have been looking a bit dim at points for the people while they were in exile in Babylon. But nonetheless, they see what is going on here. They see how God is providing for them, and they recognize that he is worthy to be praised. But unfortunately, some of the older priests, the text tells us, some of the older family heads who had seen the first temple, they wept loudly when they saw the foundation of the temple. Why? Well, probably because it wasn't as great as the previous temple. Think about all of the supplies that incredible King Solomon and all of his wealth had to put to use in building the temple. They didn't have that now. Though they had what they needed, they didn't have the extravagant wealth in order to do, what they had previously done. And so the people, they weep. The older Jews weep over this. But I want to point out to you that they do the exact opposite of those who previously rejoiced over the foundation of the temple. What they did is they compared what now was to what had been previously, and they allowed that comparison to be the thief of their joy. Let's be honest, sometimes things happen, and what had been better lays in the past, and what might be in the present might not be as good as it was previously. But simply because something is not as good as it was previously, does that mean we need to not give thanks? Does that mean that we need to not allow for the good that we currently now have to be ignored, and instead to weep because we're comparing what is now to what was previously, what was the previous reality? I think here they really failed. They really failed to just be thankful for the fact that they were back in the land. They were no longer in exile where there was no sacrifices, where there was no temple. But here they are in the land that seems they had previously walked. And instead of just being thankful for that, instead of praising God with the rest of the people, they allowed comparison to steal their joy. And friends, we should take a strong lesson from that as well. But thankfully, many others shouted joyfully, and the people could not distinguish the sound of joyful shouting from that of the weeping, because the people were shouting so loudly, and the sound was heard from far away. So thankfully, it seems like the joyous shouting was able to overcome the weeping. But let's not be that type of influence among others. If we see things that are worthy of praise, we need to praise them. If we see things worthy of rejoicing, we need to rejoice in them, even if it might not be as good as we might think was in the past. It's still better presently than what it could be. So let's think about that and learn from the example of these people here today. We see the leaders, or first of all, we see unity among the people. This great work was able to be accomplished because they were unified in their effort. Secondly, we see the leadership take up and step up and lead. They were the first ones to swing the hammer, first one to move the stone, first one to cut the log. What else do we see? We see them praising whenever success was achieved. And then we see the unfortunate example of those weeping because they allowed comparison to steal their joy. Lots for us to think about and learn from this text here in Ezra 3 today. If you have any questions or comments about this text, please feel free to leave that in the comment section below. And I appreciate you taking some time reading along with me today. Hope you have a great rest of your Thursday. And join back with me tomorrow as we read together from Ezra chapter 4. Hope to see you then. Take care and God bless.